Alright, today we're going to learn about the Black Plague and the Hundred Years' War. We have two daily objectives. Number one, list the consequences of the bubonic plague, and number two, explain how the longbow changed medieval warfare. So Black Plague, Black Death, bubonic plague, they're all the same thing. Okay. Alright, so the bubonic plague actually began in Asia, where it was carried by fleas on the backs of rats along the Silk Road. The Silk Road has been a reoccurring theme in the past in Unit 3 and 4, so I really hope you've picked up on the Silk Road. It's a trade route between China and Europe. Well, as traders are moving with their goods, along with them are rats, along with the rats are the fleas, and along with the fleas are the disease. Eventually, they're going to make it to Europe, where it has never been experienced before, and therefore there is no immunity to the Black Plague. In 1346, the Mongols besieged the Genoese city of Kaffa in the Crimea. That would be right here. So this is in the Black Sea. Remember how important this area was to the East Roman Empire. The Mongol army is going to carry the plague, and they launched plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa into the city. This is the first known case of biological warfare. The Mongols are intentionally using disease as a weapon. That is biological warfare. Now, Genoa is a city-state in Italy here, so these are Europeans that are living over far, far away in order to get trade from the Silk Road. So as anyone would do if they just got attacked by the scary disease they never heard of, they're going to jump on their ships and they're going to run away home. So that's what they do. They run away home, they board their ships, they escape to Italy. Unfortunately, some of them were already infected. They bring the Black Plague with them. So Italy is at the center of trade in Europe during this point. The Silk Road is making its way. All those Asian trade goods are making its way over the Silk Road, through the East Roman Empire, which is now the Ottoman Empire, where it's going to Italy and then spreading to the rest of Europe. Basically, along with the Chinese trade goods, the disease is going. The plague kills about 25, somewhere between 25 and 75% of Europeans. We actually don't know how many because it was so long ago. But it was a lot. This is largely because of the rise of towns and cities. Remember the Commercial Revolution? People were living in the towns and cities in order to get jobs, selling pepper or silk or whatever. Remember how unsanitary the cities were, tight together, made of wood, throwing their poop and pee and stuff in the streets because they didn't have a sewage system. People in rural areas like Wendell and Zebulon, largely unharmed because they're not really doing the trading. The people who stayed on the manor, still a part of the manor system, they're good to go. We're talking about somewhere between 25 and 50 million Europeans are going to die. It's a lot of people. Nowadays, that's still a lot of people, but we have a lot more people, about 340 million in the United States. But this is a huge proportion of the European population at this time. The plague returns every few years, so basically what happened was it killed a bunch of people. They ran into the woods because they're trying to hide, right? And they're like, oh, okay, well, nobody's dying now. It's safe. Let's go back to town. And they go back to town, and then the plague comes back. Rinse and repeat. This happens for quite a while. Major consequences of the bubonic plague or the Black Death. You have complete societal collapse, total breakdown of decency. With impending doom, the only certainty, people are living for the moment. They're spending all their money. They're doing all kinds of crazy things. They're stealing from people. They're murdering people. Again, death and theft, increasingly common. Many people believe it is a punishment from God because they don't understand diseases. They don't understand germ theory or anything like that. They just know that people are somehow, for some reason, dying, and it's not really picking like the evil people. It's picking everybody: the religious people, the priests, the cardinals, the bishops, the kings, the nobles. Everybody's dying left and right because they think it's a punishment from God. A lot of people blame the Jews, or like, well, you killed Jesus, so it's your fault. So they start rounding up the Jews and killing them, which is awful. These people called flagellants. These are flagellants. Basically, what they do is they go in giant mobs from town to town with these whips, and they just beat themselves. They think that by punishing themselves, eventually God will take mercy on humanity and save us all from the Black Plague. Of course, this is not true, but they're beating themselves anyway. These are flagellants. Make sure you use that definition of flagellants, people who beat themselves to try and protect themselves from the Black Plague, and not the Google definition, which is totally wrong. More consequences: town populations dramatically fall. Trade declines because people are kind of just holed up in the woods. Prices for goods increase because there's less goods. More serfs leave the manors. So originally people go back to the manors for a little while, but then once the Black Plague starts stabilizing and less people are dying, a lot of serfs actually start leaving the manors because all these cities are wide open, nobody's living there, and they're like, hey, we could live in the city, that'd be cool. And there are also way more jobs. There's way more jobs because there's less people. Peasant revolts break out across Europe, demanding higher wages and more freedoms. Most of these revolts are successful, actually. A lot of serfs are no longer serfs as a result of the Black Plague because people don't need the protection anymore. People don't need the land from the nobles anymore. They can make their own way because there's so many less people to have to compete with. This is a painting of a city right in the middle of the Black Plague. You can see it's a complete disaster. Whoops. Alright, so the 100 Years' War. Let's talk about the 100 Years' War very quickly. I'm going to try to summarize this as easily as possible. Here's what happens. King of France, this is France, King of France dies. He has no sons. He has two brothers. He has an older brother and a younger brother. His older brother has a daughter. His younger brother does not have a daughter. His older brother is dead. So you got the King of France, who dies, with no children. His older brother dies and has a daughter. The King of France also has a younger brother. So, the King of France's next in line is his niece, his older brother's daughter. The problem is his niece is the Queen of England. His niece is the Queen of England. His niece's son is the ruling king. So the queen was actually the Dowager Queen. She's not actually the queen. So her son is the King of England. She is the next in line to be Queen of France. So what you got are two people. The niece, who is the Dowager Queen of England, and the younger brother, who is third in line, both fighting over who's going to be in charge of France. And half the people in France say it should be the niece. The other half say it should be the younger brother. Why is this a problem? Because if the niece becomes the queen, when she dies, her son, who is the King of England, is also going to become the King of France, which means France and England are going to combine. This is problematic for a lot of people. This starts the 100 Years' War. Basically, England's Edward III, this is the King of England, who he gets a claim through his mother, is saying he should be King of France. He is going to wage war with France from 1337 to 1453 in an effort to become king of both England and France. Now remember, we've got knights running around. Knights are the preferred military unit in this time in history in Europe. Guys in metal armor on big giant horses with lances. So, here's a really cool map of the 100 Years' War. This is before the 100 Years' War. Some territory, this little green area, actually already belongs to England and France. As it gets a little uglier, we can see that you get a lot more green area. By 1429, almost half of France is under the rule of England. By 1453, the end of the war, France is settled. So ultimately, ultimately the younger brother does become King of France because the nobles in France honestly don't want an English king as their king. But we'll get there. So the knights are dominating the medieval battlefield. Everybody's cool with that. This changed dramatically with the introduction of the longbow. So the longbow is exactly what you think it is. It's a really long bow. But because it's so long, it can fire twice as far and twice as strong as a normal bow or a French crossbow. So arrows from a crossbow fire so strongly they can actually pierce the metal armor of a knight. They are also protected by pikemen, very similar to the Greek hoplite phalanx. Remember that. So basically guys with really long spears that can kill the horses as the knights are charging them. So the French, they got lots of knights. They run against the British, the English, right? The English shoot them with their longbows. When they get close, they spear them. OMG, we just changed medieval warfare. The knights no longer are on top. This is a big deal. This is the first time knights or cavalry, heavy cavalry, has been challenged in Europe for over 1,000 years. Now, longbows were originally used for hunting. The thing with the longbow is you had to train from boyhood to become a longbowman. A longbow is on average 6 feet in length, made of hew, and shot a 3-foot-long arrow. This thing is huge with a 110-pound draw weight. If you know anything about archery, that's a lot. It is capable of accurate fire up to 220 yards. It can shoot 6 arrows a minute. This thing is super impressive, and it is capable of defeating the medieval knight. Now, the longbow does not totally replace the knight at this point in history because it is so hard to train people to use a longbow. Really, only the English can do it. So the knight is going to dominate most medieval European battlefields, continue to dominate them, except when the English are involved, at which point the longbow is going to reign supreme. The knight is not going to be kicked off its horse, see what I did there, until the introduction of firearms. Alright, so 1429, this is when the 100 Years' War really starts to change for the French in the French favor. This 14-year-old girl, that would be you ladies, named Joan of Arc, starts having visions. She is a peasant. She says she's having visions from the saints. These are people who are canonized in the Catholic religion. She claims that the saints are telling her to lead an army against the English for France. Vive la France. Her first victory is at the city of Orléans. This is the original Orleans, where Joan leads just a few soldiers against the English fort and takes over the city. A broken French army, inspired by her courage, the girl can't even read, she can barely talk, she's a peasant, is encouraged and inspired by Joan. They follow Joan to war, and eventually, because of Joan of Arc, Charles VII, this is the younger brother, is going to be crowned King of France. Now, Joan of Arc, let's think about Joan in our modern context. If you had someone come up to you and be like, dude, I'm hearing things in my head, you'd probably think she was crazy. Well, if you subtract 500 years, you might think she's a witch. So the English capture her. They say she's a witch. They burn her at the stake. So, maybe that's logical. Probably not. I mean, burning people alive is never logical. But, I mean, maybe the fact that she might be a witch is logical. The English really do it just because they're scared of her, not because they actually think she's a witch. But some people think she's a witch. Enough French people are scared of her and think she's a witch that French King Charles VII, the guy who she put in power, actually does nothing to help her. But, ultimately, the English are pushed out of France as a result of Joan of Arc. Which is really cool, though she was mistreated by her own French countrymen. But she is a hero now in the eyes of France. Impact of the 100 Years' War. Nationalism first emerges in Europe. Nationalism is a super important word. Make sure you get it down. Nationalism. We're going to talk about a lot more when we get to the 20th century, as well as when we talk about imperialism. But it affects us to this day. Nationalism, if you want to define nationalism real quick, nationalism is a pride in one's country. This emerges in Europe as a result of the 100 Years' War because people no longer see themselves as just belonging to a king. Because if that was the case, the French would probably have belonged to the English king. But instead they see themselves as loyal to their country, France, and they see their king as the leader of that country, which is ultimately why they pick the Frenchman, not the Englishman. They wanted a Frenchman to rule France. They're proud of being French. It doesn't matter. They don't think they belong to anybody anymore. France had grown in size and power. The French monarchy, so the king, greatly grows in power. In fact, throughout French history, after this moment, they say that women can no longer inherit, because if the woman can inherit, then the niece would have inherited, which meant the English king would have been in charge. So only men can inherit in France from now on. Which will have some huge consequences as we get to Louis XIV, one of my favorite people in world history. And then finally, this is super important for some reason because it's always on the final exam. England's defeat in the 100 Years' War leads to a civil war in England. So Englishmen fighting Englishmen, known as the War of the Roses, which ultimately ends in the signing of the Magna Carta, which is the English Bill of Rights, which is really the first Bill of Rights. Basically, it gives people rights like jury trials and innocent until proven guilty, that kind of thing, which ultimately translate into our own Bill of Rights in the United States. So make sure you get Magna Carta, the first English Bill of Rights. Okay? Answer your daily objectives.